The protagonist wakes up and can't understand what is happening to him. He only feels that his head hurts so much that he feels as if it is going to split open. He has a memory of a young man telling him that there is a flu epidemic, but the protagonist realizes that it is definitely not the flu. He is well aware that it is something completely different, and at the same time he feels as if his whole body is on fire and his pulse is very fast. At this moment he closes his eyes from the pain, but suddenly feels that he feels very pleasant. He woke up again and immediately wondered where he was now. His face was flushed, and he noticed that there was a young man beside him. He asked what time it was, but in response, the man only told him to shut up. The white-haired guy asked the protagonist to keep his voice down, and also informed him that he was still under the influence of a special drug. Suddenly, the main character, as if he remembered something unusual, he immediately got out of bed and yelled at the white-haired guy, but he knew how to calm him down. In order to cool the ardor of the guy, grabbed the protagonist for a very sensitive place. Naturally, the man did not understand such behavior, and not long after he realized what was happening, he immediately slapped the white-haired guy's hand and ordered him to remove his hands himself. At this moment, rivulets of sweat were dripping off him. He was trembling all over and yet felt very strange. He immediately wondered what this guy had done to him, but then he looked at his hand and asked if the protagonist was really that interested to know. But he immediately said that he would not answer this question because he had a known reason for it. It turns out that this reason is that according to the white-haired guy, the main character soon himself and all we will find out. At this point, he fell him on the bed. The protagonist still continued to resist, but he felt very strange. It turns out his body doesn't obey him at all, and when this scumbag touches him, his whole body starts to burn and he feels pleasure. But then the white-haired guy smirked and looked at the protagonist and asked him if he'd ever sold himself. At which point, he starts unbuttoning his underwear. Well then, without even waiting for an answer from the protagonist, the white-haired guy grabbed him by his most sensitive spot and said that the protagonist was buying rather than selling, while he also emphasized that instead of obeying, the protagonist was the one who commanded everyone. But this guy absolutely does not agree with this state of affairs and said that from now on, everything will be different, because today the protagonist is his Omega. Naturally, the man did not agree with this. He asked the white-haired guy to stop and not to do it with him, but then he said that it was not a big deal if the man wanted to leave, because it would not affect the fact that he would still belong to him. Immediately after these words, he grabbed the main character's hands and turned him on his stomach. He immediately said that he would now raise him according to his certain methods. At this point, the action shifts to a few days ago, in a big city, in a noisy club where all the people were having fun. The two girls noticed a handsome man who walked into the room. He looked successful and very handsome, which naturally attracted their attention. Suddenly, they got in his way and said hello to the protagonist. One of them said that the guy came to her liking, and the second asked if she understood correctly that the guy is not an alpha. They began to communicate with him more openly than they had done before, and asked how about having fun together, because according to their own words, they have plenty of free time for the protagonist. At that moment, he pushed the girls away and went where he was going. Of course, the girls were unhappy with his behavior and thought that the main character was insolent, but approached one of the waiters of the place. He asked where the director Jae-hyo. Then the waiter said that the director is inside. After a small amount of time, the protagonist walked into the room where the principal was. They said hello, and we learned that the protagonist's name was Ji-chan. Immediately afterward, the protagonist bowed to the director and said that they had not seen each other for a long time, at which point the director asked why the guy was not acting so coldly towards him, and also stated that despite his current position, he still remembers from where he started. At this point, he suggests that the protagonist just have fun the way it used to be, and he naturally agrees to it, while affectionately calling the director Hyung-nim. At that moment, one of the guys who was next to director Jae-hyo asked who this guy was. Then Jae-hyo said that the main character is director Han Jinan, and is also the one who is responsible for the development of their organization. At that moment, Jae-hyo kisses his friend and says that there is no reason for him to drool on the main character. Of course, the guy immediately began to resist and asked why it is so, because he also wants to play with the main character according to his own words, but he suddenly realizes that he cannot because he belongs to Jaehyun. Jae-hyo then asked his friend if he was crazy, because he was definitely not an alpha. At which point he also emphasized that the main character's gender was only one of the problems, and there was something bigger. At this point, with a smirk at the protagonist, the director said that the biggest problem is that the protagonist is just incapacitated in some way. The young guy who was with the director at the time was surprised by this and even a little upset that the protagonist is so handsome but has such a big flaw. Then the director emphasized that he is like this already a long time ago and does not understand. What is the difference at all? But at that moment, he puts his drink on the table and getting up from his seat grabs the protagonist by the most sensitive spot asking, "Could it be that now everything has changed?" Then he notices that there is no reaction again, so he asks the protagonist if he went to the hospital that he recommended to him. But he also admits that maybe the protagonist is not reacting because Jae-hyo is also an alpha. At this point, he turns to his friend and tells him to come over to them, but suddenly the protagonist stops him and asks him to stop touching him. He immediately asks what he was summoned to this place, but then Jae-hyo pretended to be a little upset about what was happening and said that there are rumors that those who are incapacitated are not fit to be alphas. Of course, with these words, he is trying to tease the protagonist, but at the same time feeling how much Thoth grabbed his wrist, immediately said that he is going to break the fragile wrist of his Hyungnamim. Then, looking at Ji-chan, Jae-hyo asked if the guy really thinks he only contacts him when he needs something. At which point he pulled out a pack of cigarettes and said he just called and asked to meet up since they hadn't seen each other in a long time. According to him, he just wondered how his dear Tonson is doing and how things are going in the organization. For those who do not know, Tonson is a younger brother or sister and also a polite address to the younger ones. At this point, Jae-hyo lights a cigarette and says that when he stepped aside, the main character had to take everything on his shoulders. He looks at the protagonist with a smile and says, how on earth can he not worry when it comes to the safety of his prized Ji-chan? At this point, the main character gets a little annoyed with Jae-hyun's behavior, but still keeps calm and says that there are no problems and everything is fine. He says business is going well and so he doesn't have to worry about anything. Jae-hyo calls the protagonist names, but suddenly the guy who was also in the room interrupts their conversation and asks how long it can be tolerated. He asks his lover if he really wants him to suffocate in here, because according to him, the smell of pheromones is very disgusting. At which point Jae-hyo remembers that the guy is also in the room. Then he says that their cuties are having a hard time, and so he asks his younger successor to stop at this point, at which time the guy pleads for the principal to do something already. Then he left his successor and approaching his lover said, since there is no problem, let his brother continue in the same spirit and try his best to make everything good. After all, according to him, he has to do it because you never know when you might lose everything and go back to the bottom where you started. At which point the protagonist adjusts his suit and coldly looking at Jae-hyo emphasized that he would mean those words. At which point the principal told him he could go. But suddenly, when the protagonist wanted to open the door, the director asked him why he still has not gone to the hospital and corrected his shortcoming, because every time they see each other, he gets sad about it. He even wondered if the protagonist is really going to live like this for the rest of his life. But the protagonist was not confused and looked at Jae-hyo and said that if he really had some serious problems with this delicate part, he would prefer to become an Omega. He also thanked the director for his concern and said that if it were possible to fix everything, he would think about it. But he immediately emphasized that it is known that innate traits do not change. Immediately after that, he said that he was going to leave, while the director only laughed at his words. Coming out of this nightclub, the protagonist seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. He immediately thought that all that he had seen was a real abomination, and it was as if he was shaking it all off. It turns out that Han Jae-hyo is not an ordinary person. We learn that the Yuhan Group is a brutal organization that has become the foundation of the conglomerate, and this man is their leader. At the time when the protagonist just joined the organization, he was already an authoritative alpha. At this point, he also takes out a cigarette and realizes that, however, being a very humble guy and also the second director in the company, he just can't refuse him. The protagonist even began to wonder how many more reproaches in his direction will be at the meeting. Suddenly, he realizes that he cannot find his lighter. Naturally, he remembered that his lighter had been taken by Jae-hyo, which made him a little angry, and he realized that at times like this, he was missing Secretary Lee Ma more than ever. But suddenly, someone calls out to the protagonist, and looking to the side, he sees a guy who holds out a lighter to him and asks if the protagonist needs it, at which point he smiles broadly. Naturally, the protagonist wondered who this young man was, because according to his own words, he had never seen him before. Looking more carefully at him, the protagonist also wondered if this guy was an alpha. Turns out it's because it's the first time he's ever seen anyone have such strong pheromones. At which point the albino guy smiles. As suddenly, the protagonist shuddered. It turns out all because of the fact that this guy came very close to him, and taking the waist insistently gave the protagonist a light. Of course, the protagonist was not too happy about this. But then the guy who came over said that he only came over to light a cigarette. He said he didn't expect the protagonist to be so surprised. At which point the protagonist wondered why he did that and only thanked the guy for his help. At this point, the young man looked at the protagonist and after a bit of thought said that he could smell the odor that lustful alphas give off. But he also smelled the odor of cheap omegas mixed in with that odor. Upon hearing these very rude words, the protagonist emphasized that he had just left the club and believed that this smell was very natural under such circumstances. At this point, that guy once again got too close to the protagonist and said that even if it was the odors from the club, they mixed so much with the protagonist's scent that they made his own scent disgusting. Naturally, the protagonist moved away from the guy and tried to understand what this man was saying, but in order to somehow change the subject, he asked why he doesn't smoke. At this point, he learned something unique: stranger doesn't smoke. Naturally, the protagonist was surprised to hear this. But then the stranger said that he carries a lighter just in case, just because he is a businessman. Immediately afterwards, he asks the protagonist if he has understood correctly that he is the director of the distribution department of the Yuhan Group. Hearing these words, the protagonist is at first surprised, but after his surprise subsided, he immediately asked how the stranger knew this information about him. But then the mysterious man justified himself by saying that he was a businessman and said that this is why he always learns about his potential business partners in advance. Right after that, the man pulls out his business card, and then the main character notices that it is the business card of the Midas Pharmaceutical Company. He learns that this guy's name is Eugene. It turns out that the main character is well aware of the fact that the Midas Pharmaceutical Company has grown very rapidly over the past 10 years. And today, according to his information, it is known as the largest pharmaceutical company in the world. The main source of income of this firm is human-related research, and this company manufactures hormonal drugs for Alph, Bet, and Omeg. According to the information of the protagonist, the drugs that are designed for this make up 85% of sales in the pharmaceutical sector. In fact, this company has monopolized the market and is now shoveling money. It also turns out that, unlike Midas, the Yuhan Group founded by gangsters has only been recognized this year. It turns out that the company in which the main character works is not very well known in their country, and in other countries even more so. That's why he doesn't understand why this man, who is a representative of another larger company, has approached him. At which point, the protagonist asks if he has correctly realized that this is the Midas International Company. He immediately emphasizes that such a huge company is not profitable to have in business partners of the company in which the main character works. But then, Eugene said that he completely understands the distrust of the protagonist. But there is something missing in the company of Yuhan Group, the company in which Eugene works. Naturally, the protagonist asked what this guy is talking about. Well then, without too much excitement and embarrassment, Eugene stated that their firm lacked a connection to the underworld. Naturally, at this point, the protagonist was very surprised to hear this. Suddenly, he even realizes that Eugene is well aware of the fact that the Yuhan Group is founded by gangsters. But then Eugene adds that they will soon need an illegal route. Touching the protagonist's head, he declares that his company is preparing something truly great. Then he says that if the protagonist is interested in his proposal, he asks to contact him at any time. He doesn't even care if it's day or night. Eugene also emphasizes that they can meet in person at any time to discuss the matter, at which point the protagonist moves away from Eugene and says that he is the alpha, At which point the man says that he knows it well because he smelled it on the protagonist's scent. But suddenly he grabbed the protagonist by the waist and approaching his face said that things can happen. And a man who smells like an alpha suddenly can be a real omega. The protagonist, who doesn't like this kind of rapprochement, immediately pushed Eugene away from him and wondered why everyone wanted to grop him today. At which point Eugene sweetly apologized to the protagonist if he scared him, but he still justified himself by saying it was raining outside, and he only did it because he was afraid the protagonist's cigarette would go out. At this point, the protagonist analyzes what happened and realizes that Eugene came up with this excuse because he had already come out from under the canopy only after he started dodging his touch. At that moment, they both see some guy approaching, and Eugene states that he thinks someone is looking for the protagonist. He bows and says that in that case, he will go about his business. But before he left, he turned around and said that all the words he said were true, and therefore the protagonist could feel free to call him any time. At this point, the protagonist watches Eugene grow distant, but suddenly he realizes that his intuition tells him that Eugene is a very suspicious and dangerous guy. He realizes that it is better not to get involved with such guys. At that moment, his secretary comes running up to the protagonist, saying that he was very worried because his boss didn't answer the phone, and he also wondered what Director Han was doing in such a place. The secretary immediately asked if his boss had seen Director Jae Hyo, and also asked what he had said to him, at which point the protagonist did not answer anything, but only said that the guy was very caring. But nevertheless, he asked his secretary what he has knew happened, and then he said that it looks like the Holy Father will soon die. Naturally, this news excited the protagonist. Director Han immediately wonders if it's because of his heart. But then the secretary says that the Holy Father's rumored problem is not his heart, but his liver, which can't take the strain anymore. Looking at the sad face of his boss, the secretary immediately asks if he is sure he doesn't want to visit the Holy Father, at which point we can see a tear roll down the protagonist's face. But he still refuses to visit that man, and even asks how he can dare show his face there. And when the secretary tried to contradict them, the principal said they talk about it sometime later. The secretary then states that he has not looked for information in every possible way, but he has no leads on the case. But he assures that as soon as he can find out at least some information, he will immediately report it to his boss. At this point, the protagonist does not ask his secretary if he has seen the man who just left the alley. His secretary confidently declares that he has not seen anyone, but still asks the main character if he is worried about something. Naturally, the director does not answer anything, but still thinks about the fact that Eugene's face seems too familiar to him, and in order not to worry his secretary once again, he told him to forget about it. It turns out that Eugene reminded the protagonist of someone for a moment, but the appearance and character of these two people are apparently very different. Yes, and in the end, the protagonist realizes that the boy who surfaced in his memories was not an alpha, but an omega. Immediately afterwards, the secretary saw the worried face of his boss and said that he understood that there were many things that worried him, but he asked him to get into the car first, otherwise he would catch a cold. According to him, there's a flu going around lately, and he'll be in a lot of trouble if the director gets some kind of infection. But the main character doesn't quite know what he's talking about, and a little with anger looked at his secretary, asked him to stop this unnecessary care, because he does not understand why he should wear other people's clothes. So yes, the secretary immediately said that his boss better shut up, because he is always easy to catch a cold. According to him, the director needs an eye and an eye. Then he corrects the health of his boss and says that he asks the director only one thing. It turns out the secretary asked him to watch his health more carefully. At this point, the protagonist looked at him perplexed, but after only a couple of seconds, he asked his secretary to calm down, because he only talk, and when you really need it is never there. Naturally, the secretary was surprised by this and asked if his boss needed him at this time, but immediately, naturally knowing all the wishes of his boss, could guess that he did not have a lighter. Then the protagonist simply told his secretary to hold the umbrella steady. Suddenly, the secretary tired, very curious how in that case his boss was able to light his cigarette, but this question was already unanswered. At this time, Eugene watched the protagonist moving away from his car. It turns out while no one heard him, Eugene said he hadn't seen his old friend in a very long time. Sometime later, The 11th meeting is announced open in the office of the Johan Group. To start with, all the bosses of the firm wanted to talk about the previous quarter's earnings. At this moment, the protagonist was just listening intently as the other directors reported on the profitability of their company. Among all the directors was also his acquaintance Jae-hyo. In addition to all this, we can notice that at the meeting there is also the CEO of the whole firm, a man whose name is Pak Kwan-mo. We learn that it is the Assembly of Yuhan Group, and is a conference where the top ranks of all organizations gather. Here, all these people demonstrate their own power and also try to undermine the authority of other influential people. By doing so, they all have different psychological impacts in the company and fight for a higher place under the sun. The main character is watching everything that is going on. He is paying close attention to director Jae-hyo because he knows that this guy is always not sitting still, and the main character is very interested in what he is going to do this time. Then the CEO said that the financial performance report of their company's subsidiaries is all clear to him. Now looking at the protagonist, he wonders what about the distribution department of their company. Then the protagonist tells his boss that the revenue for the fourth quarter last year was 12 billion won. He says it is 1.9 billion in operating profit and 1.4 billion in net revenue. In addition, he says their company's revenue is gradually increasing. Naturally, the protagonist also says that it is safe to say that the operating profit ratio is quite high compared to other departments. But at that moment, director Jae-hyo stops him, which naturally surprises the protagonist. Then Jae-hyo decided to ask one sensitive question. He asked, "Is it true that the distribution department is faithfully managing its capital?" At this point, the man obviously wants to catch the protagonist stealing funds from the company. The main character asks, he said that he just heard somewhere that Director Han goes to some church orphanage every month and sponsors the orphanage with millions of won. The protagonist was very much surprised that his opponent had such detailed information about his actions and financial moves that at first he couldn't even say anything. At that moment, another director enters their conversation and wonders why the protagonist should sponsor this place. But then the protagonist's opponent says that he himself doesn't understand it. That's why he wants to know if it's true that the protagonist wastes the company's capital on charity. At this point, the protagonist realizes that he has no other choice but to lie, and states with certainty that it is naturally wrong. But suddenly he does say that he sponsors orphans, but has never used the company's capital to pay for his own needs. In addition, according to him, he does not think that this is an issue that should be discussed at the meeting, because according to the main character, it's a silly rumor. At this point, the protagonist's opponent states that he has yet to grow up and says that if someone donates millions of won to charity every month, it is only natural that the public would question where the money comes from. He also states that this will happen especially when the distribution department of the company in which they work is involved. According to opponents in such a case, not only the protagonist, but also the entire company may be audited, which according to him is a terrible consequence. At this point, the protagonist's secretary tells the principal that he is of course exaggerating when he says such things. But the principal immediately ordered him to shut his mouth and stay out of their conversation. He looked angrily at the secretary and stated that this is not a conversation that should be meddled with by outsiders who are not even directly related to their company. But then he also states that this is not all, and asks everyone present to take a look at some document. He hands this document to the protagonist and states that as everyone else may already know recently, their competitor Jongseon signed a distribution agreement with a Korean-Japanese pharmaceutical company. According to him now, there is a situation in the market where drugs for alphas, betas, and omegas are being developed en masse, and the stock and pharmaceutical industry prices are changing accordingly. According to him, there are rumors that their competitors have made a good profit from this contract, and he does not understand why a company that has been in the shadow of their company for a long time was able to bypass them and leave it in the lurch. He says that it is for this reason, and he wonders why the director of their company sponsors this orphanage. Naturally, the protagonist's opponent asks for everyone to understand him correctly, and justifies his questions only by saying that he is very much concerned about the future of the distribution department of their company. At this point, the CEO takes off his glasses and asks the protagonist if he knew about it. Naturally, the protagonist says he had no idea what was going on. But then the CEO was even more taken aback and angrily asked the protagonist if he realized what he was getting himself into. At this point, the protagonist recalls the moment of his conversation with Eugene and his statement that they are preparing something great. He also remembered that if he is interested in Eugene's proposal, he can contact him at any time. At this point, the protagonist apologizes to his co-workers as well as his boss for the inconvenience, but asks them not to worry about it. After these words, the protagonist majestically declares that he will be able to secure a bigger deal for his company. His opponent naturally does not believe it and asks if the protagonist can really do it, but then Han asks for permission to prove it all. According to him, he will be able to report on it at the next company meeting. Sometime later, the protagonist has already met with Eugene. The latter was very happy that he was finally able to meet again with his old acquaintance, who did not even suspect of who he was dating. At this point, we learn that the protagonist is not at all eager to meet Eugene again, but he realizes that he had no other choice, because his mistake is that he failed to find out about the contract between their competitors and the pharmaceutical company. Realizing that this is his mistake, the protagonist also realizes that if he cannot find a way out of the situation, his competitor is sure to use it against him. But naturally, he realizes that he has been given one last chance, because by saying that he can secure a deal that will be even bigger than their competitors, he was able to get a chance to make things right. It was because of the whole situation that he had to turn to Eugene, and it was because of everything that was going on that Eugene I turned out to be the main trump card up the main character's sleeve. It turns out that he does all this only because he has things that he has to protect. And it turns out that he has to find the boy with whom he was acquainted in his childhood. At this point, the protagonist does not even realize that the boy is Eugene himself. Then, during their conversation, the protagonist asks them to leave the greeting and other formalities and get right down to business. He immediately inquires, what kind of grand affair is the pharmaceutical company Midas preparing? At this point, Eugene smiled a little and said that if there were no formalities, but only a dry discussion of business, it would be very refreshing for him. He even emphasizes that he likes to dialogue in this format even more, so he certainly agrees to such conditions. But the protagonist is not interested in all this idle chatter, and he asks Eugene to stop talking nonsense. He asks if Eugene knows that before becoming the director, he was a gangster. At this point, Eugene laughed a little and said that such words the protagonist even scares him a little. Then, looking directly at the protagonist, Eugene asked if he understood correctly that in such a case the protagonist was willing to resort to violence if necessary to fulfill their deal. At this point, the protagonist thought a little and began to analyze his interlocutor. The protagonist notices that Eugene talks to him in a reserved but condescending tone, and his casualness seems to test the protagonist's patience. He definitely does not like this young man. Then Eugene laughs and says he'd like to tease the protagonist longer, but he thinks he'll just walk away. The young man then emphasizes that if the protagonist is really that interested in what will happen, he will tell him about it, and then he informs him that his company is developing new drugs. He even states that this drug has an effect on a person's secondary sex. The protagonist immediately wonders if he is correct that this drug is illegal, and then Eugene says that maybe it is, because it is a drug that the Korean Food and Drug Administration will never authorize. So naturally, the protagonist wonders what kind of drug it is. And then Eugene declares that this drug causes transformation. Or in other words, it turns alpha into omega and omega into beta. Naturally, he was very surprised to hear this, and then in a very rude tone asked Eugene what the hell his company was thinking when it developed such a drug. After he calmed down, Eugene stated that he should be aware that there are people for whom this would be beneficial, for this is nothing more than the reality they live in. He also says that often omegas are treated like girls of easy behavior and ignored, never mind their existence. At the same time, he emphasizes that in the world, the situation is such that the alphas just have to breathe, and the whole world already worships them as superior beings. He says that surely there are people who want to change these patterns of society. Eugene then declares that he too is among these people, and also considers it a very unfair outcome, at which point the protagonist listens attentively to his new buddy. Then he immediately wondered why Eugene would care so much about this, since he is the alpha. The protagonist notices that there is something very strange about this guy after all, and he really can't understand him. Then the protagonist, after some more thought, says that although Eugene's company is developing this drug to combat sexual inequality, it can also be used for evil purposes. So the protagonist asks if he's right that Eugene wants to cooperate with them so that he can sell illegal substances in peace. Then Eugene laughed a little at this statement and said that it was only partially true, for this medicine could indeed be used for evil purposes. He even said that he would show an example. Eugene suddenly grabbed the protagonist by the arm and took out of his jacket a syringe with the drug. He says that now he will show in practice how to use this drug. After a couple of seconds, he injected a certain dose into the main character's arm. Naturally, Han was very unhappy with what was happening and called Eugene asking what he was doing. But suddenly he felt very strange. The protagonist started coughing loudly. While Eugene said that the guy was mistaken and he doesn't care at all about dealing illegal substances, he says that his original target was Director Han. Already in the next scene, the main character finally woke up. He was clutching the blanket tightly with his hands and felt very strange. He felt his heart began to pound like a madman, and his face was completely red and covered with sweat. He felt very strange because even his body became very hot. At one particular moment, he saw Eugene and felt as if something was inside him. Naturally, the protagonist was very angry about what was happening. But at that time, the calm Eugene was happy that the protagonist finally woke up. Eugene says he was kind of bored while the main character was out, because he didn't react at all to what was going on. At this point, the main character was trying to contain his emotions. He felt strange and at the same time felt a kind of pleasure. At this point, he wondered what was even going on. Han remembered a few things, and the words that Eugene's company was preparing something big. He also remembered coming to Eugene to find out what they had prepared, and the moment when Eugene had injected the drug into his arm. But the strongest thing in the main character's head were the words that the main character was the original target of the Eugen, and that's why he will soon find out everything himself, because today he is the Omega of the Eugen. Naturally, the protagonist immediately began to resist and asked Eugene to immediately stop this play. But then the guy only laughed at him in response and said that it looks even cute. Turns out the main character has passed out several times before, but when he wakes up, he has the same reaction every time. But eventually, his movements make the main character feel so good that he falls back to sleep anyway. At this point, the protagonist is trying to understand why all this happened. He suspects that someone sent Eugene, and also wonders what if it is true who could do it. At this point in his head is a complete mess, because he no longer distinguishes reality from a dream. To the protagonist obviously need to return to reality. Turns out he still can't get the idea out of his head that he has someone he needs to find. A young guy with whom they spent a lot of time together as kids. Suddenly, the narrative takes us back in time. There, someone will be the protagonist at the moment when he is sleeping on a puddle. The boy was very much frightened and shuddered and immediately got up from the ground, looking at some man who called him a rascal because he had been calling the boy for a long time, and he was sleeping here. It turns out this man is the protagonist's father, who doesn't understand why his son is so incensed at him and asks him to step up. At this point, the guy says that he had a very strange dream. His father asks if this happens to him often, because according to him, his son every night mumbles something in his sleep, and therefore he is even surprised that he has not yet wet his pants. Naturally, the protagonist resented such words and said that actually he is already an adult. Well, then his father gave him his hand and said that it was time for them to go. While the protagonist was going somewhere with his father, he decided to tell him about the boy from his dream. But suddenly his father changed his face, and after a very short period of time, stated that the very boy from his dream was right behind the main character, at which point he turned around and saw someone there, which naturally surprised him. At the moment when he looked at the guy's face in more detail, he asked the protagonist why he left him. Looking closely at his face, we can see that the guy is an albino, just like Eugene. At this point, the protagonist shuddered in his bed. He was very much frightened, and stood up thinking that it was all just a dream, and then even grabbed his head. He could not understand why he had such a believable and at the same time obscene dream. But suddenly after he got out of bed, the protagonist felt pain. I realized that it was not a dream after all. He started heading somewhere, and as he looked around, he realized that this place was different from yesterday. He didn't even know where he was, and wondered where Eugene was. When he reached a door, Han tried to open it, but when he started to pull the handle, he realized that the door was locked and he couldn't get out. Naturally, he was very angry that someone had locked him in the room and started banging on the door with terrible force, ordering the one who had locked it to open it now. But seeing that no one was going to help him, the protagonist used all his physical strength and easily managed to break the handle, thus opening the door. Then he saw Eugene there. Then Eugene laughingly said that the protagonist couldn't even sit quietly for an hour, but suddenly Han angrily grabs Eugene by his clothes. He was, of course, very furious at what had happened, and glaring angrily at him, asked him what he had done to him, while calling him names again. Also, on top of everything else, he was also very much interested in why Eugene had locked him in that room. But at this moment, Eugene just looked at him and looked very calm. But suddenly he asks the protagonist what's the big deal. In wanting to lock his property in a room, he informs him that he's talked about it before. According to him, the protagonist was sold to him, and now Han belongs to Eugene. But this does not suit the protagonist at all, and he threw the mug on the ground and asked him to stop talking nonsense. At this point, the still calm Eugene began to argue that he had done nothing wrong because the protagonist is exactly the kind of person who first admires the smell of his pheromones and then gets angry at him. Eugene also says that Han is already wet from what is happening, but the protagonist naturally tried to say that this is not the case. At this point, still calmly, Eugene, as if not paying attention to the words and the protagonist's desire to reassert another, he said that even after punishing the protagonist, he cleaned up the room and changed him into clean clothes. But the fact that the protagonist got wet is, in his opinion, a sign that he is very happy with everything that happened. He then suddenly throws the protagonist onto the bed and starts holding him tightly by both arms. Naturally, Eugene immediately wonders what it would be like to turn into an Omega. After all, he is well aware that Omegas have certain moments when they cannot control their bodies because of certain factors, and the desire to feel someone's touch to get what they want. In his opinion, with people who were born, Omegas is very difficult, and they are treated as a lowlife. At this point, what he asks one last time, followed by a question as to why Eugene did this to him. But Eugene looked completely calm as before, and only smiled in response. He immediately said that the main characters soon and Sam will learn all the intricacies of this process, and the reasons for it. And then, with a deft movement of his hand, he removes the belt of the main character. As before, Han asks Eugene to let him go, but naturally he once again cannot influence Eugene's wishes, who completely dominates him. At this point, the protagonist realizes that he can't breathe. While Eugene is surprised that the drug worked so quickly, he said he was very curious about when the hormone-transforming drug would take effect, but he still couldn't expect it to be so soon. After saying that, he noticed how excited the protagonist was and said that for the first time he was starting to feel like an Omega for real. Hearing these words, the protagonist became very excited and began to shake. But it could not end so easily. Jin threw him on the bed again. Then Eugene began to look closely at the protagonist's mouth and said that his body temperature was elevated and his heart rate was elevated, but still all the indicators were within normal limits. He said compared to his normal state, his pheromone level had doubled. Eugene then begins to examine the mouth of the protagonist and confidently declares that judging by the color of his tongue, he is fine. But for the sake of truth, he notices that it is slightly reddened. And he also notices that there are no side effects from the drug, because even the protagonist's pupils are not dilated at that moment. But everything turns out to be not so smooth as Eugene supposed, because the main character becomes very difficult to breathe at this moment. He even asks for someone's help, which naturally notices Eugene and immediately changes in his face. But he immediately realizes that the protagonist seems to be completely covered, and he starts acting like a full-fledged Omega. At this point, Eugene said that he didn't think that changing the secondary sex could provoke such effects, because it had not been observed in clinical attempts. So it was a bit of a surprise to him. Then he states that maybe the main character has been a born Omega his whole life, but just didn't know it. The protagonist wanted to stop everything that was happening, and mentally he was ready to beg Eugene to stop. But suddenly he grabbed him by his clothes and realized that this is definitely not going to happen, which he naturally stated openly, saying that even if he dies, he will not beg Eugene to stop. After a couple moments, he gets out of bed and again being very angry says that he is leaving, so he asks Eugene not to get close to him. But suddenly, many of the protagonist's legs give out and he falls to the floor. Then Eugene says that apparently the protagonist doesn't really understand what's going on. He says that if he tries to escape during these processes in his body, it would mean that he is openly screaming for someone to take advantage of him, or maybe to be taken advantage of by a mob. Then the arrogant Eugene says that this is why he doesn't want to leave his new friend to his fate, and he should stay here, after which he roughly grabs the protagonist by the hair. Naturally, Eugene doesn't forget to remind the protagonist once again that he is now his property, but the protagonist still opposes it and tells Eugene to stop talking such nonsense. Eugene then says that there is another way to somehow kill the protagonist's ardor, and claims that he can use the ingredients for this process. He immediately asks the protagonist if he even knew such a thing existed. Eugene then pulls these special pills out of his backpack and says that since he works for a pharmaceutical company, he certainly has them on him. The protagonist watches Eugene get those pills and realizes that inhibitors are the only way to cool his ardor in any way. But Eugene showing them to the protagonist says that if he complies with his request, he will of course give them to him, then realizes that he has no other choice. Han asked what he has to do, but Eugene's request turned out to be, as usual, a request of a very unusual nature. And then the protagonist was surprised by this and declared that Eugene was delusional again. But realizing that he is in a desperate state, the protagonist still decided to fulfill this request. After which, Eugene said that judging by all the actions of the protagonist, now he is the perfect Omega. He also emphasizes that because of this condition and secondary gender, the protagonist even started thinking like a real Omega. But the protagonist didn't like these words at all, and only told Eugene to give him the inhibitors quickly, because he said he would get them after all. At this point, Eugene says it's true and pulls out the pills, puts one in his mouth, and tells the protagonist that if he wants them, he can have them. The protagonist naturally can't do anything about it, and declares that someday he will kill Eugene for all that he has done to him. But when the protagonist tried to pick up the pill, Eugene intentionally swallowed them and proceeded to taunt the protagonist by saying that he thought he accidentally swallowed them. Then the action of our story moves to the office of the company for which the protagonist works. There, his secretary answers an important call, while another subordinate told him that he brought information that the secretary had requested earlier. At this time, the secretary asks the other subject to wait for a while and informs him over the phone that she apologizes, but Director Han is away on a business trip for a while. He asks the person who made the call not to worry, because as soon as the director returns, he is sure to tell him about such an important call, while the employee is waiting for his turn. After that, he went to the secretary and asked if there was still no news from the director. He even wondered where the director could go for so long, because it had been 3 days already. He reports that apparently the director's business trip was a little longer than it turned out to be, but at this time the secretary is a little sad, because he knows perfectly well that there is no business trip. He remembered how one evening he asked the director where he was going tonight, but then the main character said that he wanted to go to a very important meeting. But of course the secretary keeps this information quiet and does not tell anyone about it, so that everyone would be calm. His recollections are interrupted at the moment when an employee of the firm declares that in any case, he has brought all the meeting materials requested by the secretary and the documents he wanted to see. He also says that one of the clients was looking for their director, but at that time the man who was waiting to meet the protagonist said that it was too much, because he is almost the protagonist's family and not a client. It turns out it's director Jae-hyo who wants to know if it's normal that they made him wait so long. He says he's been sitting in his pants in the waiting room for a long time. Naturally, the secretary immediately asked what the man was here for, but then with disdain, he asked, did they really think he couldn't come here without some definite work motive? He says he only came by to ask if everything is all right with the con. The secretary then says it would be nice if the man would give advance warning of such visits. But then he only responds that he tried several times to call the protagonist, and he did not answer any of his calls. This naturally did not like the man very much, and so he showed up directly to the office. But at this moment, naturally he noticed that even in this place and could not find the main character. At this time, the secretary says that his boss is now on a business trip, and probably he does not answer because he is very busy. But then Jae-hyo doesn't believe these words, because he assumes that most likely the main character could not go on a business trip without a secretary. In his opinion, it looks very strange. when suddenly, quite unexpectedly, he grabs the very documents that the worker had brought to the secretary, which naturally surprised him very much. And then, in order not to share the secrets of their distribution department, he snatched the file with the documents and, apologizing, said that these are confidential documents of their company, and even though this man is one of the directors, he still cannot show them to him. At this point, Jae-hyo called the secretary a heartless man and even inquired, "Is it true that he has no right to know where he has gone?" And here, dear friend, it was said in a sarcastic tone that was evident at once. But then, touching the chest of the protagonist's secretary, he said that perhaps from this business trip, the protagonist will never return again. At which point, the secretary was as if even ashen, but he angrily replied to the principal saying that such a thing could not happen, and then removed his hand from his chest. After only a couple moments, Chae-hyo got very angry and said that if they didn't want the company to fall into very bad hands, then the main character should go back as soon as possible. After these words, he laughed at the secretary and said that his face looked the same as the protagonist's. Then the man turned away and said that since the secretary said that his friend was not here, he would leave and come back another time. And then, according to him, the protagonist had better be at his workplace. Naturally, the secretary immediately tried to call his boss again. But as usual, he failed, and it turned out that the main character is out of range. This whole situation worried the secretary very much, and he was trying to figure out how to solve this situation. So he wonders, where is his boss now and what he is doing if he does not answer the phone? After some time, when it got dark outside, the main character shuddered and woke up on the bed in the living room. He realized that he had lost consciousness again, and realized that the situation had happened again. He starts to worry about this situation more and more, and he also notices that his whole body is marked with bites. He doesn't understand what he did to Eugene that he decided to make such an experiment on him. But at the same moment, looking around the room, the protagonist realizes that Eugene seems to be gone, and he needs to get out of this place immediately. When he gets to the door to leave, Han realizes that it won't be so easy for him to leave. He realizes that apparently Eugene doesn't want to let him go, and even wonders how many days it's been since he's been in this place. He realizes that he has to go back soon, because he's been away from the company and the workplace for too long. And also he realizes that he still needs to find that man, and until he leaves here, he can't do that. Suddenly, the protagonist notices a key that is not far from him, but suddenly it turns out that this key is not the key to the front door. Then the protagonist suggests that maybe it is the key to Eugene's office. As a result of this assumption, the protagonist decided to try to open Eugene's office with this key, and succeeded, after which he was able to enter the kidnapper's office with ease. He began to look around the room carefully, and realized that if he tried hard enough, he might be able to find the key to the front door that was kept in the room. And when he began to search the room, he found something very strange in Eugene's desk. Naturally, it surprised the protagonist, and he immediately decided to take a closer look at what he found there. It turns out that this photo, which brought closer, we were also able to see, it turned out that this photo depicts the father of the protagonist with the very boy who is looking for the protagonist. He does not understand why this photo is here because he still does not have any information about where the boy is. Suddenly, some young guy comes in the house and asks the protagonist if he is still here. Then, noticing the open door of his office, he went in and said that he had arrived a little early because his classes were over. The protagonist finally seems to realize everything, and the young man who asked him why the protagonist is here without light decided to turn on him. At this point, the main character was finally able to see this guy's face. And it turns out that it wasn't Eugene, but some other person who looked a lot like him. Naturally, from so much surprise, the main character could not hide all his emotions, and he immediately said the name of the boy. It turns out that his name is Mito. Then the action moves to Eugene's office, where he is very much engaged in his work. Suddenly, he hears a knock on his door and asks that man to stop knocking and come into his office. Suddenly, a young man walks in and says that the director is still as cruel as he used to be. Turns out this guy's name is Han Sun-yi, and he's a senior researcher at Midas Pharmaceutical Company. Then Eugene says that this man has no right to say such things, because he himself is very violent. And Eugene asks why he is doing such inappropriate things, at which point the man says that his colleagues complained about him, saying that he is always hysterical, and so he decided to make them hysterical too. At this point, Eugene wondered what business he had come to his office for. But then the researcher looked at his principal and asked if he really had no clue about it. He also emphasizes that, according to his knowledge, the director has some information that he also needs to know and hear from Eugene's mouth. At this point, the director hesitated a bit, but immediately relaxed and said that everything was fine with their test subject. He states that there was no immune rejection or other attacks, and everything was even on the contrary, because the protagonist adapted perfectly. Naturally, the researcher asked what else was going on, and then Eugene stated that the pheromone levels were normal, but he assumed that they were still unstable, that the protagonist had started the omega processes, which surprised the researcher, and he immediately asked if he had used inhibitors to stop it. But then Eugene asked, does the researcher really think he would give them to him? At which point the researcher says that really such a thing should not happen, and it should be out of the question. It turns out he even sympathizes with the protagonist and says that he feels sorry for the man who got caught by their director. He wonders what he will do if there are any unexpected problems. But then Eugene says that it is unlikely to happen because the drug was developed by Dr. Han himself. At the same time, he notes that the researcher is a real genius, and therefore he is 100% sure in the efficacy of their drug. But then the researcher himself said that geniuses are also inherently wrong, and while realizing that maybe he should not talk about it, but he thinks that if something goes wrong, their test subject could die. Hearing these words, Eugene got a little worried and turned his back to his researcher and said that if this was going to happen, it was destined to happen. Then the completely indifferent researcher said that in any case, the words of their director were quite enough for him, and he needed to do a thorough examination. So let the director bring his test subject to their lab sometime. He also states that it would be nice if the director could find a couple more test subjects, because he wants to do another experiment. So he asked if anyone else but Eugene. He naturally hesitates to answer, but then says he will think more carefully about it. After a while, it's nightfall outside and Eugene is driving his car somewhere. It turns out he's still haunted by the word that if something goes wrong, the test subject could die. He's glad that the protagonist was able to survive after using the drug. But suddenly, in the head of Eugene came some memories from his past. It turned out that he had lived a very hard life, and at a certain point even stayed on the street. At that point, he had nothing to do but to get in touch with gangsters who naturally did not respect him at all and even treated him very badly. But then someone was able to spot a boy who was shivering with cold and fear on the street and reached out to him. At this point, Eugene once again declares that if his test subject dies, it's heaven's will. But he still doesn't want that to happen because he wants the protagonist to go through a real hell. After some time, Eugene finally returns home, where he sees a very unusual picture. The same young guy is talking to the protagonist. He says that he does not like the fact that the protagonist is holding him so tightly, but Han asks Mita to listen to him, while the young man himself doesn't understand what the protagonist is saying and asks him to let him go. It's at this point in their conversation that Eugene intervenes and wonders what's going on. Then the young man says that the protagonist is asking him about Mido. At this point, Han once again pounced on the Eugene and grabbed him by his clothes and asked him what ties him to the Mido. Suddenly, a young man intervenes in their conflict, asking the protagonist what he is doing and asking him to keep his hands off Eugene. Then with surprise, the protagonist looked at the young man and asked the young man if his name was really not Mido, for he looked very much like the same boy from his childhood. But then the young man was already very angry and asked how many times he had to say it. He once again claimed his name was wrong and told Eugene that the main character was crazy. Then, Eugene tried to calm the guy down, but he said that the protagonist had snuck into the office like a rat and seemed to see something he shouldn't have seen. So the protagonist said that's exactly what happened, but still kept insisting that Eugene tell him what the picture of his father and Mido were doing in his office. But Eugene didn't even think of doing that, and only said that he didn't have to report to the protagonist. Dear friends, and if you want to see the continuation of this interesting manga, then be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Also, do not forget to put likes under this video, and do not click on the bell to not miss new videos. And the second part we will release when under this video will collect 40,000 views or 5,000 likes.